This is Michael Popok, Legal AF, with breaking news. The Department of Justice has had enough with the continued refusal by the Jan 6 Committee and its chairman, Benny Thompson, to turn over all 1,000 plus witness transcripts and evidence to the Department of Justice to allow it to continue to investigate and prosecute all those responsible for Jan 6th. It's a little known skirmish, but it's been going on since the summer, and it's now reached a fevered pitch as the Jan 6 Committee is in its final waning days, yet continues to refuse to turn over all of those transcripts and evidence. And for all those that are taking pot shots at the Department of Justice, understand this: while we have appreciated the Jan 6 Committee and we patiently await their final report, every moment that they have delayed in turning over that investigative material that they have collected to the Department of Justice, because I guess they didn't want things to leak out before they had an opportunity to make their public presentation, which, yes, has a benefit, but at the same time, you have to acknowledge that it is undermining the ability to bring people to justice. The requests by the Department of Justice, strange as that may seem to those people sitting out there and listening and thinking, why aren't these two aspects of the government cooperating to bring to justice those that are responsible, including Donald Trump? Why isn't the Jan 6 Committee doing its civil duties as a part of the House in investigating and putting on a hearing, while cooperating with the Department of Justice in its criminal prosecution functions? It just hasn't happened. Benny Thompson and Liz Cheney have steadfastly refused from the late summer and early summer to turn over these transcripts. And if anybody out there thinks that this has not had an impact on the prosecution, it has, because for every piece of evidence that the Jan 6 Committee already has in its possession, every transcript that it's already obtained is a document, a piece of evidence, a transcript, a testimony that the Department of Justice is forced to recreate itself in order to prosecute that person or investigate that person. That has led to an inexorable amount of delay in the Department of Justice, one for which they have continued to take tremendous criticism, and Merrick Garland included, in prosecutions, but they've had their hands tied behind their back as they've had this motherlode of evidence and information in the hands of the Jan 6 Committee, which has steadfastly refused to cooperate with the Department of Justice, which is mind-boggling considering they have said publicly, at least, that their one true audience for their presentations, all 8 or 9 of their hearings, is Merrick Garland, that they want to make a criminal referral. Well, they could have been cooperating with the Department of Justice since the summer, all the way through now November, so they wouldn't be in a situation where at the last minute, when they're doing a going out of business sale on the eve of the new Congress coming into place, they're then going to allow Merrick Garland and his prosecutors to pick through all of their investigative materials. This has been one of the weaknesses of the Jan 6 Committee. While we've appreciated all the work that they have done and these 8 hearings that have been put on for the public, what we really want, what our listeners and followers of Legal AF really want, is criminal investigations and prosecutions to proceed without further delay. And Merrick Garland has had enough, and he's now made yet another demand today on the Department of Justice, on the Jan 6 Committee, to turn over their records. And for those that think it's no big deal, besides the fact that the Department of Justice has to recreate from scratch all of the material the Jan 6 Committee has at its fingertips, it also puts the Department of Justice at a disadvantage and possibly emboldens defendants at trial to argue that potentially exculpatory or material that would prove their innocence is sitting in the hands of the United States government, in this case the Jan 6 Committee, but has not properly been turned over to them, which is required under 2 constitutional cases, one called Jenks and one called Brady. If the Jan 6 material is considered to be by a judge Jenks and Brady material, its delay in months in being turned over to defendants could likely lead to indictments being dismissed and ultimately to cases being dismissed outside of the jury by a judge. And the higher up we go, up the chain of culpability to the apex, to the Donald Trumps, to the Mike Flynns, to the Giulianis, to the Powells, to all of those people, the more likely they will raise there were statements somewhere in the Jan 6 committee materials that should have properly been turned over to the defense in order for them to mount a defense. Why even have this argument, Jan 6 committee? Do your job, but allow the Department of Justice to do its job and don't undermine any of the prosecutions that's going forward. We have a Department of Justice that's been supremely successful so far. They're 7-0 in trials against Jan 6 insurrectionists, including swinging for the fences and hitting a grand slam home run against Stewart Rhodes and one of the other leaders of the Oath Keepers on a seditious conspiracy charge. Not only is the seditious conspiracy charge probably the hardest criminal charge for the prosecutor to make stick in front of a jury ever, and carries with it the greatest penalty, which is 20 years in prison. But the Department of Justice was able, as of the verdict this past week against Stewart Rhodes, to prove seditious conspiracy without having a defendant even enter the Capitol. Think about that. We have 2 convictions by the Department of Justice just this week against people for the highest level of charge, sedition, and those people, admittedly, undisputably, did not go into the Capitol. Think what that charge in the hands of the Department of Justice now, with the wind at their sail with these convictions, will do when the Department of Justice goes after the bigger fish up that food chain. And we don't want anything to stand in their way. The Department of Justice has methodically worked through all of the witnesses, tearing away all of the privileges, executive privilege, attorney-client privilege, getting lawyers to be compelled to testify against former clients, in this case, in the West Wing, including Donald Trump's own counsel, own chief of staff. And now we're going to hand the defense a potential victory. We're going to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory by having somebody be able to successfully argue that the Jan 6 committee sat on material that should have been turned over to the defense. That would be a shame, and we'd all be wringing our hands over it. The right thing for the Jan 6 committee to do today, in November, in December, is the right thing they should have done back in the summer, which is to allow the Department of Justice parallel access to the material and have it turned over, and not require the Department of Justice to sign 3 separate letters and make 3 separate demands, including by the Attorney General Merrick Garland, in order to even obtain the material as late as November 30th. That is something that we may rue the day that the Jan 6 committee held so close to its territorial protection, which comes off, unfortunately, looking very political and not turning it over to the Department of Justice. If we're going to go after, ultimately, Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, Sidney Powell, Ali Adams, Giuliani, all the people that were around the hub of the spokes around the hub of Stewart Rhodes, then we need to be able, on a seditious conspiracy charge, for instance, to be able to have no relevant pushback on the other side that witness material was withheld from them at all. The Department of Justice has a tremendously strong case on seditious conspiracy, especially after this recent victory, and the Jan 6 committee needs to get out of the way of the Department of Justice and turn over this material, and not wait for a 4th request from the Department of Justice. We'll be following this breaking news on Legal AF at midweek with Karen Friedman-Agnifilo, and on the weekend with Michael Popok, me, and Ben Meisalis.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy. And look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs, It Wasn't Rigged, You're Just a Loser, at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.